look. Right. Yep, Chapter 8. Coalition Crossfire, Anti-Violence, Organizing, and Interracial Grape. Women's efforts to end violence often comes out of coalition. In the turn of the century, anti-lynching campaigns, Ida B. Wells, enlisted the assistance of English women and men. Later, white feminists such as Texan Jessie Ames Daniels publicly opposed racist violence that was justified as a protection of white women from black men. In coalition, Wells, Florida, Raffin Ridley, and Mary Church Terrell noted that the persecution of grape was determined by a social status of the woman assaulted as well as that of the accused. Contemporary anti-racist feminism are rooted in a build on historical coalition and analysis of lynching and grape. These anti-racist campaigns were also waged against sexual violence as women activists responded that at end to lynchings as well as false and illegal persecution would increase the likelihood of legitimate and legal indictments in grape cases. In 1904, responding to an editorial verifying African Americans, Mary Church Terrell of the National Association of Women of Color, they flipped it, wrote, quote, "An error on the subject of lynching consists of the widely cultivated statement that the moral sensibilities of the best black person," they used the N-word with the color, "in the United States are so stunted and dull, and the standard of mortality among even the leaders of the race is so low that they do not appreciate the enormity and hideousness of grape. 4 generations later, we appear to be still haunted by the error of the notion that most women of color protect men of color who grape. Multiracial alliances in the United States are fairly difficult to sustain. Racial antagonisms and distrust fray, if not splinter, coalition politics. When activists try to work together in polarized interracial grape cases in which the assault is marked by a ferocity of violence, the alliance can often resemble a battlefield. Amid these high controversial cases, the work of women denouncing both sexual violence and racism is the legal system tends to become a casualty in the crossfires between divided camps and anti-racist and feminists. In New York City, in the late 1980s, diverse and multiracial groups of women formed around the 1987 Tawana Brawley case and the 1989 Central Park case. In the Brawley case, women agreed to stage a rally and march through the red light districts in Times Square with placards that read, quote, "Stop violence against women," and Tanaya is our sister/daughter, end quote. Yet no consensus could be reached to have a women's delegation meeting with Alton Maddox, Vernon Mason, and Al Sharpton, or even to support anti-hate crime legislation sponsored by David Patterson. Then, pending in the New York State Assembly, this so-called victimless crime against a black teen, Brawley, accused several white policemen of sexual molestation and rape, was widely dismissed as a hoax Indeed, no evidence was offered by Brawley and her attorneys. Nevertheless, because those accused of the assault represented the bastion of white male privilege to exercise violence with impunity, and because the alleged victim represented those most vulnerable to sexual violence, progressive women sympathized and quickly mobilized around the case. The Central Park jogger case proved to be much more explosive. Difficulties in organizing stemmed from the brutality of the assault. Unlike Brawley's case, this was no fabricated crime. The survivor of viciously attacked and left for dead. In addition, women activists had to contend with historical mythologies concerning racialized sexual violence that dominated this case. African American and Latino teenagers were arrested and convicted for a violent rape of a white woman survivor. During the first collective trial, a local television station aired a clip of Latina spokesmen for the gathering of Black and Latino women, demonstrating for the conviction of the defendants. In the clip, she referred to Tawana Brawley and Al Sharpton as, quote, circus animals, end quote. Early, Brawley and Sharpton had visited the trial in support of the defendants, and in an interview with reporters, Sharpton maintained that the youths were being denied due process. Rather, the Latina statement reflected her personal sentiments of anti-Black racism or her frustration with those who focused on a fair trial for a defendant rather than on the survivor, or both, is unclear. Nevertheless, the image of circus animals was imprinted on fair trial advocates, irrespectively of their stance on sexual violence. No worries, Void. African American males charged in interracial rape cases do not inspire much credibility, even among non-whites. In fact, historically, African Americans communities were initially reluctant to support defendants in the Scottsboro case in the 1930s and the Harlem Six case in the 1960s, in which Black defendants were falsely accused of assaulting a white females. After years of imprisonment and political agitation for justice, the defendants were eventually released. In the Central Park case, the majority of Black people, like their white counterparts, likely considered the youths guilty of attacking the survivor. But African Americans were more inclined to believe that the Black and Latino youth would not get a fair trial. Although mainstream media frequently reported the misogynist statements of black people who insisted on the youth's innocence, much of the media censored and censored those who spoke against both racial and sexual violence. For the most part, feminist fair trial advocacy, as well as the multiracial women's coalition, went unrecognized. And that's the end of that one. I'm going to go back and make sure. Rolling on the floor laughing. I wonder why we're laughing. Are you a communist? Yes, I am a communist. Absolutely a communist. I'm a leftist, but please don't make me read, bro. Okay, then don't read. All right, back to it. Women and fair trial activism in the Central Park case. During the first collective trial, the problematic aspects of the state case did indeed motivate women into fair trial activism. The following narrative may or may not explain why some women publicly took such an unpopular and controversial stance. On April 20th, 1989, at 1:30 a.m., two men found a brutally beaten, unconscious woman in a muddy ravine in Central Park. The two collective trials in 1990 for the assault ended with the conviction of 6 African and Latino youths. After the first collective trial in August 1990, Atron McCrae, 16-year-old Yusuf Salam, 16, and Raymond Santana, 15, received and began to serve a maximum youth sentence for rape and assault, 5 to 10 years in prison. Their appeal attorneys included William Kunstler for Salam and Vernon Mason for McCrae. During the night of April 19th, the woman was violently assaulted while jogging in Central Park. That same night, approximately 15 African Americans and Puerto Rican youth were assembled around 9 p.m. and entered the park, scattering in groups of various sizes. Some African American and Latino youths assaulted several men in the park and threatened others. Youth who were detained while exiting the park around 10 p.m. And those picked up for questioning in the following days became suspects in whatever crime that occurred in Central Park that night. Those detained had been dispersed earlier throughout the park. These youth were with other males who entered the park that night and moved about at different locations and exited in different times. Within several days, the New York Times and the other mainstream media sources dubbed the survivor an upper-class American woman who worked as an investment banker for Salomon Brothers. The, quote, investment bankers, or, quote, the jogger, investment banker, or, quote, the jogger, the detained African American and Latino teens became known as, quote, the Wolf Pack. Many of these sources at this point also denounced the suspect as guilty. The first New York Times article to cover the assault appeared on April 21st, written by Craig Wolf and replying on uncorroborated police statements for its information. It ran under the headlines, quote, youths rape and beat Central Park jogger, end quote. All subsequent Times coverage was consistent with the tone of the first article. In this climate, the claims made by the New York City African American press and some activists that was premature, quote, conviction had turned the case into a legal lynching were dismissed as misogynist or racist. Because the case had already assumed a mythic proportion of a morality played police officials and assault and assistant district attorneys involved in the case played up racial and sexual myths and imagery. European American journalist Michelle Hammer described the, quote, callousness of the methodology that justified the survivor. Quote, how many times have we heard the word miraculous, as though the gods themselves were on her side. This miraculous recovery has been expressed as a triumph of good over evil. Her extraordinarily good attitude, the result as the myth would have it, a good breeding, good family, good schools, good job, has made medicine itself seem almost superfluous. Her good attitude has prevailed over bad boys from bad families who had bad things, including lives, in that bad part of town where the good jogger somehow strayed. In the stiff and demanding mortality of this myth, only the miraculous recovery will do, because her recovery is not came when Salomon's brother named her a vice president. It was as if to say not only had she not lost ground, she had gained. And gains could be made only by getting ahead, not by wavering. That's the end of that quote. By promoting and then appending themselves to the reconstruction of the survivor as an icon, police, or legal official came to represent all that was good, or at least safe, while the youths represent of Clockwork Orange type and criminality, symbolized in the violent grape scenes that open and close that film. Assistant District Attorney Elizabeth Lederer and Linda Fairstein, as white women, became simultaneously the avengers and symbols of victimed white women avengers by assuming the male roles of state prosecutors and symbols by appropriating the body and voice of the survivor. The highly visible presence in turn feminized the state's role in the case. When the survivors testified for 15 minutes during the August 1990 trial, it was to detail her recovery from the brutal beating. This account was used as testimony against the youth whom she could not identify as her assailants. Lederer and Fairstein were the only women who claimed in court that the youths had sexually and physically assaulted anyone. The court that the youth had. Okay, good. With repeated displays of medical photographs taken as soon after the assault of the survivor's battered and partially nude body, the state introduced the woman's body as evidence of the youth's guilt. In fact, however, only words, those of Lederer and Fairstein and the police and the teens, except Salam, own incriminating, contradictory, and repudiated statements connected the youth to the body. The Manhattan District Attorney Office listed the file of the Central Park case as closed, although Lederer publicly acknowledges that there is still a quote rapist out there, end quote, connected to the assault. Even though physical evidence existed, police never attempted to find the male whose semen matched that found on the survivor. Generally, the issue of a fair trial appeared newsworthy only to African American media and individuals skeptical of most other reports. Not surprisingly, arguments for presuming innocence until the youth were proven guilty contained information largely unknown or ignored. Popular sources tend to present accounts critical and of the prosecution sporadically or only within narratives of conviction. Details that challenged the indictments disturbed a social equilibrium posed on the image of youth's savagery. Given the absence and evidence that the sensationalist pre-trial judgments, progressive activists argued that critically re-examining the Central Park case would help to demystify the racial and sexual stereotypes that shaped most media's representation of it. Such a critique would also address critics' suspicion of media, police, and court activity surrounding the trial. Some argue that the media and the police traded a just judicial process for a cloak and chivalry, citing those officials rapists, rhetorical and selectively sincere opposition to the endemic of sexual violence and abuse of women. This chivalry was apparently reserved for upper-class white women. The white media paid little attention to the Grape's brutal beating or murders of 25 women of color, reported the same week of the assault. The police concerned response to the September 1995 murder of a Brazilian woman who had been jogging in the park was a marked departure from earlier reactions to assaults against women of color in the late 1980s. The reluctance of some women and men to accept the prosecution's narrative stemmed in part from a questionable aspect of police activity on the case. Most media sources, even those who pretrial judgments greatly threatened the possibility of a fair trial. Observed that convictions would be difficult in the absence of a physical case against the youths. Police had obtained neither witnesses nor evidence, blood, semen, hair, soil, fingerprints, footprints, or skin tissue, to connect any of the defendants in the first trial to the scene of the crime. Still, in the spring of 1989, without collaborating physical evidence or witnesses, mainstream media sources essentially convicted the youth. The basis of those and later jury convictions rested on the so-called confession of a videotape and written statements taken from the youth men during police interrogation. Some defense attorneys maintained that the police officers intimidated or assaulted several of the youths during these sessions and detained others for long hours without food or sleep. Timothy Sullivan describes troubling aspects of jury deliberations as well. Jurors who already believed that the youths were guilty reconstructed reality. Quote, Junior Bruland believed he could read the lips of one defendant on videotape. Tapes were redacted and discerned Salam's name. In fact, neither McCrae nor Santana named Salam any place on the tapes. The continuous pretrial replaying and rehashing of the videos tapes on television and in print gave them the reality dependent of their correspondence to the fact. In some videotaped statements, the young men spoke of the wrong location of the assault, describing holding down the arms of the survivor who had found bound and gagged and misidentified her attire. Inconsistencies in the prosecution case were reported in various smaller journals. Breaths, quote, the media, Grape and Race, the Central Park Joggers case, end quote, argue that it was more accurate to refer to these disposition as, quote, self-incriminating statements, end quote, rather than confessions, given their contradictions and the questionable conditions under which they were taken. Along with the video statement, the youth's inconsistent and factually incorrect written accounts were conveyed in a language that was unbelievable to some. Now in Newsday, which among the predominantly white New York Daily has the most critical of the prosecution, ran several stories questioning the validity of the case built on these statements. In Salam's moms also waited for evidence. Carol August wrote, a detective read a supposed, quote, confession of Raymond Santana. It sounded like a cop talk in its purest form. There never was a 14-year-old working class kid that ever talked the way Santana is supposed to have talked to the police that night. Quote, we met up with an additional group of approximately 15 other males who also entered Central Park with us. We all walked southbound in the park in the vicinity of 105th Street, end quote. We who are watching this trial all have more than we think in common with Miss Salam. We are waiting to see if there is any believable evidence that will connect these kids to the crime. So far, we haven't heard any. End of that. Unlike Santana and McCrae, Shahriman Salam's son, Yusuf, gave no statement. He also passed a lie detector test soon after the assault, supporting his assertion that he was never at the scene of the crime. The collective trial proved particularly disadvantageous for him. For him. Some argue that in such trials, a defendant risks being assumed guilty or association with his or her confidence. The presiding judge, Thomas G. Gillian, whom some black people and white progressives refer to as a hanging judge, was allegedly selected for the case by District Attorney Robert Morgenthau. Gillian mandated collective trial. The New York Times reported in 1990 that the Morgenthau offices were charged with anti-black biases by NAACP's legal counsel on the issue unrelated to the case. An assigned confession attributed to Salam was written by Detective Thomas McKinney, who 2 days after his interrogation, and including more information than was found in McKinney's notes taken on April 20th, the night Salam was detained by the police. The fact that McKinney admitted that in order to induce Salam to confess, he lied to him during the session, telling Yusuf that his fingerprints have been found on the survivor's clothing. Although Salam told McKinney he had not been at the scene of the crime and knew nothing of the assault, most media sources condoned McKinney's action because the detective publicly confessed to lie to a 15-year-old. He retained his integrity and credibility as a cop. Without eyewitnesses or collaborating witnesses to testify that the young man on trial attacked the survivor, the prosecution team could only call on themselves and the police to testify to a validity of the incriminating statements obtained during the interrogations. In fact, the district attorney had a strong case against other youths implicated in attacks against male joggers and cyclists in the park that night, detailing how police admitted to breaking the law in order to obtain incriminating accounts. Village Voice writer Rick Hornog predicted that they, quote, engaged in conduct so improper that it will undoubtedly be the grounds for a strong appeal, even if the defendants are found guilty, end quote. According to Hornog, the pretrial hearing revealed that the police violated all of the following state laws protecting juvenile rights for separating all the children from their parents, Fifth Amendment and Sixth Amendment rights for at least 3 defendants by failing to inform them that their rights to remain silent and to consult an attorney, the Fifth Amendment right against compelling self-incrimination. Regarding this last mentioned violation, police officials with Linda Fairstein transported several of the youths involved in the second trial without defense lawyers or parents to the scene of the crime in order to have them, quote, put themselves in it, end quote. More convincingly, the refusal to accept statements from the police or prosecution team led to progressive fair trial activism. I distinguish here between progressive fair trial activism, which critiqued sexual violence and researched specific facts concerning the case, the reactionary fair trial activism, which represented a misogynist defense of the youth or denied the reality of the assault. Both types of activism merged during the case altogether, although the latter was usually privileged in mainstream media accounts. During the first collective trial, Women in Mother Love and the International Working Women's Day Committee, IWWDC, called a citywide meeting of anti-sexist, anti-racist activists advocating for a fair trial. Mother Love and small Harlem-based women's group created a support support the mothers of the defendants, had organized forums in the Harlem community. The IWWDC, a group of African, Latina, and Euro-American women activists, had held educational events on March 8th celebrating women's contributions to liberation movements. At the suggestion of Mother Love, IWWDC issued an open letter to the community through progressive media channels such as African American journalist Rosemary Melays WBIA radio show. The group invited representatives from women's and social justice organizations to attend the educational forum on the case on July 19th, 1990. At the Martin Luther King Labor Center, local 1199 in Manhattan. That night, lawyers, journalists, and activists, all representing different political views, spoke to the packed meeting room, mostly filled with African American, Latinos, and European American women. The key presentation came from IWWDC, citing the traditions of legal lynching carried out in U.S. courts. Group members linked the Central Park case as a Scottsboro case in the 1930s. The Harlem Six, a George Whitmore cases in the 1960s, and more recently, the Carol Stewart case in Boston. In all these cases, innocent African American men were imprisoned for violent crimes against white women. Because the innocent of the Central Park case defendants could not be proven beyond a reasonable doubt, these previous cases were used by IWWDC speakers to emphasize the flaws of the racial and sexual biases of the judicial system. The need to prove innocent in order to mobilize for a fair trial is in fact an inversion of the U.S. legal system where in theory only those proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt can be convicted. Without proof of the youth's innocence, many acquiesced to police malafidant. I gotta really look up this word. Be right back, everybody. Malfeasance, wrongdoing. Malfeasance, and unfair legal proceedings. As one African American male colleague put it, quote, "They railroaded the right guys," end quote. Such views were shaped by the media. Village Voice reporter Erica Monk's, quote, "body politics at its worst," end quote, described the July 19th organizing session as a anti-survivor event. Although present at the forum, Monk focused on black women who were minor speakers and depicted them as major spokespersons. In addition, she attacked one woman journalist who was a forum organizer, but not a future speaker. Monk also described the black woman as unformally hostile to the survivors and to white women in general. So he was fucking a racist, or she. And yet, Monk's report did not reflect the reality of the forum. For example, one African woman who worked on a city task force on sexual violence and abuse strongly criticized a black woman lawyer who condemned the defense lawyer refusal to cross-examine the survivor with harsh rhetoric about her. Black women at the forum generally focused their comments on the police and perceived malfeasance and deviance rights to fair trial. Few, if any, made reference to the survivor. White women were not identified by name in this article. In fact, Monk failed to note that the presence of any white women at the forum, or to state that the key address was given by a white woman, Suzanne Ross. A reader might easily assume that the forum was a black woman's rather than a multiracial woman's gathering. Consequently, Voice readers were led to believe that the worst, quote, body politics, end quote, were espoused by black women who were both hostile to white women and sympathetic to black rapists. Jesus Christ. This biased report on the anti-sexual violence work of all women, including black women in coalition. Within the week, on another radio program at the more mainstream liberal station with small black audience, however, she reportedly asked rhetorically and impatiently, quote, "Where are the black women?" end quote. Clearly, she was implying that African American women have made no efforts to condemn the violence. Monk resigned from The Voice that summer after participants in the forum presented Voice editors with a detailed account that contradicted her report. Because more people read The Voice than attended the forum at local 1199, the perception of fair trial activism was publicly retrogressive, dominated. Those present, however, encountered another form of politics. In her Keystone Address, Susan Ross used Angela Davis' essays, quote, "Grape Racism and the Myth of the Black Rapist," to analyze the historical and political aspects of press coverage and the exploitation of the survivor as a racial or sexual icon by the white press. Ross connected Davis's critiques of the white obsession with African American men as rapists with an analysis of who this mythology rendered a prosecution of sexual violence against women of color a legal aberration. And downplayed sexual violence in white women's lives and their complicity in this obscurantism, just as anti-lynching activists had done in the 19th century. IWWDC members argued that these unexamined racial and sexual mythologies providing the culture and social backdrop for interracial rape cases, increasing the likelihood of lynching and the social indifference of it. Forum leaders also maintain the legal lynching legitimized violence and the state's refusal to prosecute sexual crimes seriously. Finally, forum organizers urge audience members to investigate for themselves the legitimacy of the prosecution's case by attending the trial, to join anti-racist and anti-sexist coalitions, and to recognize that the denial of the democratic right to a fair trial would set a dangerous precedent for everyone. Demands for justice in the Central Park case were often condemned from mitigating and condoning sexual violence. Activists who argued that racism and classism created an unfair judicial process and the violence against women was unacceptable were criticized by media sources that depicted all fair trial organizing as anti-white or anti-female. African Americans who made misogynist and sexist statements throughout the case were portrayed by the mainstream press as representatives of the reactionary politics of African Americans in general, a fair trial activist in particular. This selective focus on misogyny and the general social outrage that accompanied by reports enable these convictions, narratives to ignore or obscure the weaknesses of the prosecution's case, thus erasing the distinction between the brutal assault on the one hand and the prosecution of the youth on the other. Without the critical distinction given, the emotionalism and media hype surrounding the case, criticism of the prosecution was portrayed uniformly as criticism of the survivor. Support for the youth's right to a fair trial then appeared as sympathies for rapists. The possibility of being outraged by both the violent assault against the survivor and the mishandling of the case became a public anomaly, as it had a century ago. The dominant media sources mandate that no context exists for simultaneous organizing against sexual and racist violence, assuring that most of the public equated progressive organizing with reactionary denial that the attack was horrific, that African American men assaulted white women, and that sexual violence is a deadly epidemic. Stigmatized as counter-feminist, fair trial activism was rarely recognized as part of the discernible racial African American traditions of anti-violence organizing. Even black feminists writing for predominantly white publications obscured the complexities of the case, allowing only narratives of conviction to bear the responsibility of feminism and moralism, as legitimacy became based on one's distance from fair trial activism. Criticism of the state's prosecution was transformed into an indifference to sexual violence. The desire to remain distant from such a critique stemmed from the unpopularity of the stance given the pretrial publicity that depicted the youth as guilty. This aloofness also was connected to another desire not to be identified with misogynist or anti-survivors statements made by African Americans. Both desires worked to discourage investigative research and critical thinking. The multiplicity of the responses among African Americans to this interracial rape case ranged from an inflexible certainty of the youth's guilt, which precluded any critical studies of the prosecution's arguments, to the considerable hostilities towards the courts, police, and white media, and antagonism that for some extended to the survival as well. Although some African Americans vilified the survivor, others, especially those engaged in progressive politics, expressed their concern for her as well as their general adherence to sexual violence. For instance, East Harlem District Leader William Perkins, an activist, Reverend Hubert Daltrey, questioned the legitimacy of media's narratives of conviction and organized a prayer vigil for the survivor soon after the attack. New York City leaders included white feminists spoke at the vigil in general. However, most progressive arguments for critically rethinking the case, particularly political efforts by African American women, were minimized, ignored, and derided in mainstream media sources. Conclusion. Most media sources describe coalitions that denounce the state's prosecution as indifferent to sexual violence. Depictions of fair trial activists as mostly disgruntled black people, motivated by racial paranoia and anti-white sentiments, disqualified such activism as a legitimate choice for anyone in political mainstream. Only those, rather conservative or liberal, who support state prosecution could convincingly call sexual violence abhorrent, although prosecution is not synonymous to pro-feminism. The term here constructed and wore as such in the Central Park case. Individuals strongly advocating prosecution, such as conservative commentary Patrick J. Buchanan, were free to express misogynist and racist views. Women and men, including those not noted for their progressive gender politics, chastised women, including feminist activists who advocated fair trial proceeding for being anti-feminist. This condemnation was often customized to fit the ethnicity of the woman. If the fair trial activist was black or Latina, she was accused of being anti-white and sympathetic to rapists. Valerie Smith uses this argument against Ida B. Wells. If she was white, she was accused of being a race traitor, bleeding heart, and sympathetic to rapists because of her racial guilt. Any woman, regardless of her ethnicity, who criticizes the state procedures was susceptible to the charge that she had subordinated sexual politics and racial politics. The stigma of these accusations produced two types of obscurantism. First, the charges erased the prominent roles of multi-ethnic coalitions that included a considerable number of racial white women and lesbians who did not consider the state their natural protector in the face of sexual violence. Second, such charges discouraged investigations into the specifics of the case, portraying all state critics as sharing a widely publicized misogyny of angry black people. When I initially wrote about the first collective trial in 1989 case, I made no study of the second trial. Focusing on media coverage, women's fair trial forums, and my court attendance during Salam's testimony and cross-examination, I was warned to limit my observation to critiques of the racist representation, underscoring the youth's guilt rather than the assumption of their guilt. Questioning the validity of any of the convictions was considered a breach of civility and morality, and as such, the causes for more of an outrage than an incarceration of a defendant who had been denied due process. In 1993, a white woman janitor professor at Amherst College gave a talk of representation and the Central Park case. A senior white male professor responded to her report as inconsistencies in the prosecution case, but bluntly asked whether she was saying that the youths were innocent, by evading the question, perhaps because the only logical response would have been, yes, they're innocent, end quote. Given her arguments, she retained her mark of civility and sexual respectability. She remained neutral by serving her speech about severing her speech about racist representation from political and ethical stances that directly challenged the incarceration of convicted. To suggest that possibility that some of the defendants might have been convicted on the basis of representation rather than evidence was viewed as crossing over the threshold of responsible discourse. Few intellectuals would take that step. Those who did, from the status of social pariah, continued to write and organize to demystify the case, as well as perceptions that black women are generally indifferent to sexual violence. Although there was more physical evidence introduced in the trial of O.J. Simpson for the murder of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman. In that case, most commentators refrained from making partial judgment. During the Simpson case, more than a few African Americans would see institutional racism as a primary issue rather than a sexism or misogyny of the assault. Because black and Latino youths in the Central Park case lacked Simpson's wealth and popularity as a transracial entertainer, the earlier declaration of their guilt was predictable. Any state wrongdoing in the Central Park case would go relatively unchallenged, except by some marginalized critics, whereas the Simpson case, maleficence, along with inconclusive evidence, became the cornerstone of his defense and acquittal. In the aftermath of Simpson's acquittal, however, the diatribes against black women jurors and black people in general became so extreme that they marked a new turn in American racism and sexual politics. In a culture profoundly ignorant of racist mythologies, state violence, and women's racial radicalism, black women's politics on racial and sexual violence are easily misrepresented as uniformly counter-progressive. Historically, in interracial rape cases, radical women activists have worked to determine the facts of the case, dependent on information and narratives of the dominant media, and have refused to validate uncritically the notions of state prosecution as protection. Women have also dialogues with other organizers and writers cognizant of local street politics, progressive activism, and repressive policing. The presence or absence of similar strategies in contemporary responses to racialized sexual violence determines the schemas between anti-racist and feminist progressive politics regarding interracial sexual assault. We got, all right, teaching, community, and political activism. This is section 4. This page is left blank, and the chapter is 9. Discredited knowledge in the nonfiction. Toni Morrison, African American intellectuals and academic questions. Let me see here. I'm gonna go to, let's see here. Okay, let's see where I'm at when I get to that. All right, here we go. Let's start us off. African American intellectuals and academic questions. The education of the next generation of black intellectuals is something that is terrifically important to me. But the questions black intellectuals put to themselves and to African American students are not limited and confined to our own community. For the major crisis in politics, in governments, and practically any social issues in this country, the access turns on issues of race. Is this country willing to sabotage its cities and school systems if they're occupied mostly by black people? Seems so. When we take on these issues and problems as black intellectuals, we are doing what we are doing is not merely the primary work of enlightening and producing a generation of young black intellectuals. Whatever the flashpoint are, they frequently have to do with, oh my gosh, amelioration, enhancements, or identification of the problems of the entire country. So this is not parochial. It is not marginal. It is not even primarily self-interest. Toni Morrison, quote, African American Intellectuals, Life at Princeton, and Conversation, Princeton Today. In her nonfiction essay, Toni Morrison's dissection of racist paradigms is framed by a worldview that testifies to African American ancestral spirits and centrality. for transcendent communities and her faith in the abilities of African American intellectuals to critique the civilized racist society. Reading Morrison as a cultural observer and a practitioner, I share the sensibility that privileges communities and ancestors while confronting dehumanizing culture, representation, and practices. I quote from Morrison nonfiction to sketch a frame of viewing her observation on racist stereotypes and black resistance. Even in its incompleteness, a sketch reveals clues from deciphering how Morrison uncovered and recovers grounds for, quote, discredited knowledge, end quote, in which traditional and contemporary culture beliefs held among African Americans are connected to political struggles. The outline of the conceptual site or worldview is not an argument for black essentialism. Recognizing the political place of African American culture's views, which manifests and mutates through time and location, constructs these views neither as acquisitional. I gotta look at this word. Quintessential, or universal to everyone of African descent. Likewise, a passionate interest in African American intellectual and political resistance to anti-black racism is not synonymous with the indifference of non-African Americans or the accommodations of Eurocentrism of white supremacy. Let's go back a little bit. Welcome everybody who just came in. Stop talking and debate. What? Debate me. Debate me! Ah! Morrison explores the intellectual service of African American educators in ways compatible to the roles of African philosophers as development within through service is described by Sarah Quamberia. Quote, the calling of the African philosopher comes to us from a lived history whose adherence and sacrifice against slavery and colonialism has made our presence and future existence in freedom possible. Oh, gotta do the, here we go. Gotta do the puzzle piece. Yeah, I did it the first time. Look at me. Look at me go. El capitalist, yeah, for sure. Death to communists! Whatever. Morrison explores the intellectual services of African Americans, educators, in ways compatible to the role of an African philosopher as development within and through service is described by Sarah Quinburn, called, quote, the calling of African philosopher comes to us from a lived history whose endurance, and sacrifice against slavery and colonialism has made our presence and future existence in freedom possible. The reflective exploration of African philosophy are thus aimed at further enhancing and expanding this freedom, end quote. This call for African philosopher or theorist shared by African American intellectuals predates imperialism, enslavement, and racism. If, as Morrison argues, the question that African American intellectuals raise for the amount among themselves reverberate beyond black communities, even exploring a worldview that presents service and community as indispensable, time and space as expansive, knowledge as intergenerational and responsive to the conditions of people and community as a changing transcendent, but nevertheless shared the thorny tie would frame responses to state violence and resistance to oppressive culture practices. Morrison's essay raises a number of questions about the possibility for critiquing and developing curricular paradigms that acknowledge realities greater than those recognized by conventional academia. Worldviews contextualize educators' lives and shape how they develop curricula, pedagogy, and scholarship to talk about, or silence talk about critical theory or racialized knowledge. Educators can challenge and reinforce academic relationships to the worldview of alternative thinkers such as Morrison. For instance, teaching her writings without a critical discussion of racism and slavery is perhaps not uncommon. Appropriative act that reproduces racial dominance. In Morrison works discussed below, one finds the demystification of racism tied to a deep commitment to the well-being of African Americans. Educators who unravel these ties depoliticize the racial nature of her writings and, in effect, repoliticize the work as comparable with intellectual paradigms that are indifferent to racist practice of American society. In the classroom, expanding the intellectual canon to include Morrison and others, people of color, women, poor, working class people, gay, lesbian, bisexual people, for more inclusive and representative curricula does not subvert racialized hierarchies. Adaptive curricula do not inherently democratize education in a integrative reforms. The axis of the universe remains the same. For instance, Bell Hooks notes, and this is Bell Hooks, a white woman professor teaching a novel by a black woman writing, Toni Morrison, Sulua, would never acknowledge the, quote, race of the characters and not including works by, quote, different writers in the manner that challenges ways we have been traditionally taught as English majors to look at literature. The public standpoint of any professor engaged with the development of culture studies will determine whether issues of difference and otherness will be discussed in new ways or in ways that reinforce domination. So Bell Hooks is a black woman. Yeah, this is someone I'm learning about just now. So Bell Hooks is another black woman who is paramount to black feminism in the feminist movement. So Bell Hooks came out with a book called Feminism is for Everyone, and they came out with multiple different ones. So if anybody's interested, check out Bell Hooks. Bell Hooks is another feminist that should be studied and investigated. At best, additive curricula that offers no critique of the dominant worldview, civilized racist practices. At worst, they function as decorative shields against critiques of Eurocentrism, rather where analysis of whiteness as a meta paradigm are absent. Critiques of racialized oppression are inefficient to create a learning environment in which teaching critical work maintains rather than dismantles communal ties and subversive insight. See, like, that's the thing. I fear that if, as white people, if we're going to deconstruct our racism, we need to provide a space working alongside those that experience racism, if they're willing to do that, to make sure and observe that we're on the right track of dismantling our internalized racism and the racist societies. You know what I mean? So, like, white people, we have lots of fucking work to do. Song of Solomon, one of my favorite works. Nice. Nice. More accurate representation of the diversity of intellectual life and work of transgressive African American intellectual requires a context greater than the traditional academic paradigm. Perhaps the only way to attain greater accuracy and honesty is to stand on some terrain within some worldviews other than the legitimized by Eurocentric academia. Engaging in this, quote, dangerous solidarity, racial work, end quote, we might finally confront the academic precedent penchant of playing in the dark. Penchant. Huh. I wonder what that means. I'm gonna look up that word. Hello. Penchant. I don't even know if I'm saying it right. Be right back. I was getting better at this. Penchant. I said it right. Who's in here? All right, penchant. I got mad at the word. I don't know why. I have to look it up. I don't know. I didn't mean to sound mad. My fault. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to sound upset. My fault. Penchant. A strong or habitual liking for something or tendency to do something. Penchant. 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 I think that's why it sounded bad. So I was saying it aggressively. I admit I was saying it aggressively. I was saying it aggressively. You're correct.
السلام عليكم. From Gaza, أنا من غزة. الله يكرمكم، ما في مجال تساعدوني. نواكب الطعام. عليكم السلام، الله يكرمكم يا رب. أنا من غزة، ما في مجال تساعدوني بأي شيء. الله يكرمكم. بدك أما أجيب قصة حين والله أظني 3 أيام ما أكلت إشي. الله يكرمكم يا رب. لو تساعدوني بأي شيء الله يكرمكم.
If you can, please, anybody can donate. I don't have coins at all. So if anybody can donate, they'll be much grateful. So I'm going to read another section. I'm going to see how far it is. So I might read another section because I have 20 minutes. Okay. All right. No. Okay. 192. Hold on a second. 192. People remember 192. Remember 192. Is that it? Oh, wait. I missed one. I think I missed one. Hold on. Oh, my God. I forgot. Where was that? Oh, there it is. Okay, traditional work. Okay. All right, let me see. 187. Hold on. Traditional work. 87. 187. 87, 88, 89. I think, let's see what happens when I get to page 189. Let's do that. See what I get to from 189. All right, traditional worldview. I think that's where I'm at. Yep, okay. Traditional worldview. All right, here's someone. This is Toni Morrison. And rootedness. So this is Toni Morrison. Is it Tanya? Is it Tanya or Tony? Is it Tanya? Which one is it? Tanya being 1 or Tony being 2? 1 or 2? Which one's right? Yeah. So is it Tony or Okay. Maybe I'm trying to do too much. The Song of Solomon. Bear with me. Okay, so it is Tony. Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you. I could blend the acceptance of a supernatural and a profound rootedness in the real world at the same time, with neither taking precedence over the other. It is indicative of the cosmology, that the way in which black people look at the world. We are practical people. We're down to earth, even shrewd people. But within the practicality, we also accept what I suppose could be called superstition and magic, which is another way of knowing things. But it blends those two worlds together at the same time, was enhancing, not limiting. And some of those things were, quote, discredited knowledge, end quote, that black people had. Discredited only because black people were discredited, therefore, what they knew was, quote, discredited. And also because the press towards upward social mobility would mean to get as far away from that kind of knowledge as possible. That kind of knowledge has a very strong place in the world. Toni Morrison. Rootedness. That was good. I like that. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, I'm definitely not a literature major. I didn't even go to college. I went to like 2 years, and I went to like 2 semesters, and just was horrible. Distinguishing worldviews from superstitions requires sketching the cosmology that grounds Morrison work. Some black writers posited a non-hegemonic perspective in which one, community or collective or the collective is central rather than individual achievement or individualism. 2, the transcendent of spiritual is inseparable from the mundane or secular. 3, nature, quote unquote, is a force essential to humanity. And 4, feminine and masculine are complementary rather than contradictory components of identity and culture. These beliefs considered illogical in conventional U.S. culture, of course they are not exclusive to the African-centered point. You know, and that's the thing. I mean, I haven't heard much of like of black people's creation stories, like just a comparison. But like I see that with indigenous creation stories and how the mysticist and the objectionist, the objective come together and actually complement each other. Like creation stories from indigenous people is so comprehensible and makes sense to me. You know? These are similarities between traditional African cosmology and other cosmologies. Cosmologies, yeah. For instance, in some traditional Native American worldviews, the concept of community also extends through time. For example, the Native American discussions of the 7th generation. What some call superstition or magic, John Mbiti describes as an aspect of cultural worldview in his book, Traditional African Religion and Philosophies. Here we go. Most traditional peoples believe that the spirits are what remains of human beings when they die physically. This then becomes an ultimate status, a point of change or development beyond which one cannot go apart from a few national heroes who might become deified. Man or woman does not or need not hope to become a spirit. She is inevitably to become one, just as a child will automatically grow to become an adult. And I can't say his name right. It's Mbiti. Mbiti notes that historically African worldviews have maintained non-linear time in which the past, present, and future coexist and overlap. This view is also held in other cultures and in some scientific community. Traditional African cosmology sees, I'm going to look up that word. I'm going to look at the word. Alaikum salam. How you doing?
بارك الله فيك يا أخي جزاك الله خير أنا أحتاج المساعدة يا أخي. الله يبارك فيك يا أخي.
Effects.
الله يوفقك يا رب.
Effect. No, wrong one. All right. Here we go. I'm glad Miriam's here. All right. The science of an origin or development of the universe, modern astronomy, is dominated by the Big Bang Theory, which brings together observational astronomy and practice and particle psychics. I don't know. I'm sorry. They bug me. I have a learning disability. I think my learning disability is being more seen as I read and try to study shit. I'm seeing like what my problem is, you know, enunciation, identifying pronouns, nouns, and subjects, and identifying like adjectives and shit like that. Like, I need to work on that. I need help. I want a school that I want to go back to like one class to teach me the basics of like studying and comprehension and reading and stuff like that. Just like a basic class to relearn again. Cosmology. Okay, here we go. Traditional African cosmology sees to non-duality of time and space, rather than suggest a monolithic African Mbiti's work describes the diversity of religions throughout the continent. Yet he maintains that various organizing principles are prevalent despite ethnic and societal differences. The cosmology he documents rejects the socially constructed dichotomies between scared and secular, spiritual and political, and individuals and community that are characteristic of Western culture. This perspective reappears in African American culture. Worldviews or values are not deterministic. One may choose. In fact, Mbiti, an African theologian trained in European universities, selects Christianity, depicting it as superior to traditional African religion, which he notes shares Christianity monotheism. We may elect to reject the traditional worldviews that shape African culture as Mbiti does. Or we may reaffirm these values as Morrison does, stating that, quote, discredited knowledge, end quote, has, quote, a very strong place, end quote. In her work, Morrison refuses to distance herself from a traditional African and African American culture worldview, despite the fact that academic or social assimilation and advancement, quote, would mean to get as far away from that kind of knowledge as possible, end quote, without considering the validity of this discredited knowledge or academically marginalized belief system. Some may portray Morrison's work as romantic, ungrounded mysticism, outside of the worldview that recognizes the value mirrored in her work. It is difficult to perceive of Morrison's as anything other than exotic. Her fiction is not a mere phantasm. As her nonfiction explains, she writes within the framework of African American culture, values, and political and spiritual perspectives. Morrison's work clearly relies on African-centered culture paradigms that are documented by anthropologists, theologians, philosophers, and sociologists. For centuries, these paradigms have been derided by Eurocentric thoughts and dismissed as primitive superstitions. The invalidation of these frameworks is traceable to European colonization on several continents for several centuries. Historically, European racial mythology determined rather people whose physiology and ancestry were strikingly different, were comparable were capable of creating theory, philosophy, cosmology, or were merely able to ape superstition. Today, the rejection of discredited knowledge held by non-fully assimilated African Americans breaches from this disparagement of the African origins of these views. As Congolese philosopher Kai Bunsiski Fukua notes in quote the African book without title. Here's his quote, or their quote. Africa was invaded to civilize its people. Civilization have, quote, accomplished her noble mission. African people are still known as people without logic, people without system, people without concepts. African wisdom hidden in proverbs. The old way of theorizing among people, or oral literature cannot be seen and understood in the way the Western world sees and understands proverbs. For us, proverbs are principles, theories, warehouses of knowledge. They have, quote, force de lieu, the force of law. That's the end of the quote. Peoples whose traditional culture is supposedly known to be illogical without complex belief systems are generally received as racialized societies as dubious contributors to intellectual life or theory. Spoken and unspoken debates about their epistemic I can't say the word. Hold on a second, everybody. Oh my gosh, highlight it. Come on. Thank you. Be right back. EM. It's epistemic, my bad. Epistemic. Epistemic soul culture ranged ideologically from reactionary conservatism to progressive radicalism. Morrison writings are radical precisely because they reject the Eurocentric labels of primitive for African cosmology and the epistemologically aspects of African American culture, all the while, cognizant of the view of parts of European culture, critiquing the racial stereotypes of white supremacy. She asserts the presence of traditional communal culture as connected to Black and African ancestors. Challenging the hegemonic paradigms, Morrison delineates and deconstructs the European American muse, addiction to ethnic notions. She issues two contemporary calls for politicize the spirit, to resist the racial mythology embodied in white European American imagination, and to reconnect with the values rooted in traditional African American culture. Of these values, the one that provides the foundation for her work is that of African American communities. To her writings, Morrison draws down the spirit to house it in community. And I think I'm going to stop there. We're going to go back, and it's going to be the central, I can't say the damn word. Central, let me look it up. Sorry, right back. It's centrality, the centrality of community. So we're going to stop there for the day, for the night. We ended on page 189. 189. Interesting. And you know what? And this is the thing too. Like, white people do not have a sense. We have a connection. It feels like that our connection, our domination and spirituality in the whiteness is Christianity. Even though there are other religions that are not Christian. But this is a Christian ethno-state. This is a Christian dominated ethno-state here in the United States. So the dominant force is Christianity, which has been like completely bastardized and all that shit. It's just, hey, Doodly. But like, yeah, culture is important for people. And like indigenous people, oh, let's try again. I'll try again. Hold on, Doodly, let's try again. I don't know if Dooley was... Oh my gosh, what happened? Try again, Dooley. Are you there? I'm trying to get to you. I'll send you an invite, Dooley. There we go.
Okay, hello.
Hey. But I think a lot of white people do not have any connections. That's why we expropriate every fucking kind of culture and religion.
Yeah.
Because we don't have one of our own, because whiteness completely takes that completely away.
Yeah, whiteness, the community of whiteness is denial, whereas every other community seems to be of a affirmation.
Yes.
So in the communities of black people or other, in general, people of color, they have communities that affirm existence, whereas white people are so like set on like destroying an other that we don't realize that we're destroying ourselves too.
And creating them as objects instead of actually subjects. You know what I mean?
Yes.
What's up, Finn?
I just wanted to add, I hope that all of you are doing all right, by the way. I just wanted to add up to what you and Doodley were saying.
Sure.
I would say that, I don't know if this book mentioned it or not, because I've never read this book, but I believe personally that a lot of this has to do with Abrahamism. I wouldn't say it's only like a Christian problem. I think it's just like the three Abrahamic religions deeply installed into European society, because a lot of indigenous culture and civil in Europe has been completely erased.
Yep.
To the point that, I'm not kidding you, there's no trace of it. And so what happens is that the Abrahamic religions kind of like programmed us, and I'm saying us because I'm a YT person. Can I say that word in here?
You can say white. I've been saying like sexual assault, so you can say whatever you want.
Okay, well, I'm a white person, so I'm just speaking. That's why I'm saying this. There's like just a lot of in our culture where like we have self-alienated ourselves from it, and obviously because of the spread of Abrahamism, specifically the Western and Eastern Catholic Church.
Yeah.
So, like, for example, I mean, bringing up Romania again, like I was talking about in the other, in the other live. Did you know that in Romania there isn't a single museum of our like original civilization, which is the Hamangians? No, it's not the Dacians. I kid you not, there is no such a thing.
Yeah.
And so that's one of the things, and so that's why us white people, we just don't appreciate. We're just kind of very indifferent about preserving like certain traditions. We will only preserve traditions if it's like something that helps us exploit other people or control you. So that's why there's a lot of white people who say, well, I really love to preserve Christian traditions and all that. But then you ask them, oh, but you didn't care to preserve the pagan traditions that came before Christianity in European civilizations. So that's just what I wanted to add to it.
Yeah, because if you look at the Irish, right, and you look at their colonization, apartheid, and all that stuff, they were stripped and taken from their cultural practices and their religious aspects too. That was like that. So yeah, England did a whole bunch of damage to that. So yeah,
And as much work as I'm doing to try to learn about Cymru because of being Welsh. I'm having trouble finding any documentation of what the culture was like before colonization.
Yeah.
Same. I have a hard time finding anything, even just a simple article of, like I'm having a hard time finding an article of what the original Romanian and even the Magyar, because my dad's side of the family are both Hungarian and Romanian. I have a hard time finding any concrete piece of historical document where it specifically talks about us. No, like we're just mentioned like in a very broad, general cases of history, if you get what I mean. Like, oh, we were mentioned at some point for like 2 seconds in some stupid. Sorry, I shouldn't use that term. In some History Channel article.
Ridiculous.
Oh, can I say ridiculous? Yeah. So yeah, ridiculous. So I apologize. So yeah, that's
You're good.
Sorry, I lost my train of thought.
You're good. And like Josh mentioned it. Like here's a concern. I can see this concern. Josh mentioned this in the it says, I'm English, Irish, German, and Dutch. Where am I supposed to go to my roots of? Kind of hard to be. Yeah, that's true. So like I would say like what Joe is saying is good, but it's not. It doesn't. I'm Irish, German, and Dutch, and all that stuff. But it's not bad to look at each of those things and try to draw some connection to those things before the whole like white supremacy, colonization, imperialism happened. Which is like what we're finding out here is like they did very like I can have solidarity because going back to my Irish roots, going beyond the 13 colonies, I can't find anything because they burn a lot of historical documents of those things. You know what I mean? So it's hard to connect as an Irish person to those roots in some ways, because of what they did to those people. You know what I mean?
Yep. I mean, the best thing that I've done, I don't know if any of you have done this, but I mean, the closest to reliable method that I've currently been doing for 4 months is, yes, I went ahead, I took one of those corporate DNA tests, and right now I'm messaging with a person who has a last name of my maternal side of the family. But again, they're not the European side of my family, they're the Syrian one. So I'm just trying to find out which specific village we're from, because I know that, so that's the best thing I'm able to do personally. Hopefully you can find a similar method to that.
And right now we see that now that Palestinians have been dispersed and there's some Palestinians there. We're seeing that now. We're seeing the erasure of a culture completely. You see in Sudan, the Congolese people, and many other places. You're seeing how white supremacy just erases everything that is seen as different or not part of the hegemony of white supremacy. Because what it does is it strictly challenges that position. And it strictly challenges it to the fact, I think, that it says that the fact that race is a social construct, it does show materially, but we know who's forcing that material condition. We see who's forcing that material condition. You know what I mean?
Yep.
So
that's actually a good point. Yeah. Honestly, communist, I would agree. Because I do remember, I mean, back when my grandfather was alive, he would tell us stories that his parents would tell him, which are that we used to have like there's still a joke amongst the Levant. It's like an inside joke that all Levantine people we have, that if you say that you're from Aleppo, which is where my mom's family are from, we kind of like joke around with each other saying, oh, you're from Nablus. Or if you say that which is in Palestine, but if you say that you're from Nablus, they're going to say, oh, you're from Aleppo, which is in Syria. So that kind of joke stems from the fact that before the British colonization and even before the Ottoman colonization, there were no such thing as police checkpoints. So I kid you not, you could literally walk on it with a camel from Nablus all the way up north to Aleppo in Syria. And it was so easy. And so because a lot of people, came back and forth and switched around between Nablus and Aleppo, that's where that inside joke stems from. But that really tells you that phenomenon that you're explaining to me of how white supremacy brings this sort of like this very destructive structure to already occurring cultures.
Yeah.
I talk too much, but yeah, that's pretty much the whole point.
You're good. You are good. Thank you for validating that. And any critiques and validations is fine, for sure. But and I like this book because this book also talks about how the United States forces some types of state violence even to the global peripheries. You know what I mean? So they did mention that briefly with Nicaragua, with Cuba, and all those things in the global South. They did that. So yeah, I'm about to close up, Pally. So I'm about to close up here quickly. So I'm sorry I'm not bringing you up. Next time I go live, if you come in early, I'll bring you up. I promise. But yeah. So does anybody else have anything to say before I close it out?
Do the best you can to connect with others and help fight against this shit. That's all I gotta say.
Get knowledgeable. Start reading. Start deconstructing. Start being part of the solution instead of being part of the problem. That's my thing.
I would also recommend start trying to learn your native language. I'm still trying to learn Arabic and Hungarian and Romanian up to this day. I think that's a very good starting point because if you come from a family that's specifically self-alienated because they got brainwashed by white supremacy, I think that's a really good place to start in order to resist, and that's what I'm doing. But maybe it might be different for the two of you. So,
yeah. Amen. Bro.
Dude,
anyway.
I'm seeing. Oh.
Well, talk about it. So, yeah, I get it. We're seeing so many communists that are capitulating to it. I get it. I see it too. Anyway, I gotta go feed Rufus. But
okay.
Yeah.
Goodbye, everybody.
All right. Good night, everybody.
Bye.